In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make this bowling style of bag. It's very similar to a bag that I made years ago, which you may have seen before on YouTube. The sizes, the dimensions are a little bit different to this one. I put a pocket on the front. You can put one on the back as well if you wanted to. I haven't put any pockets or dividers or anything like that on the inside, but if you wanted to add maybe a patch pocket or a letterbox zipped pocket on the inside, then that's entirely up to you. All of your materials and your cutting instructions are in the description box below, so have a read through those, get all your materials ready, and let's get sewing. I've cut out all of my pattern pieces and I've fused fleece to the wrong sides of all of the outer pieces. So the next thing I'm going to do is to round off the top of the bag. So to do this, I'm actually using a Sharpie, which I don't normally use on fabric, but this is so heavily patterned, I really wanted to make it stand out for you. So I'm folding it in half like so. I want to do it from this side, and I'm measuring 11 inches, so I'm just keeping the 11-inch point of my ruler at the point of the fold there and drawing a little mark. Then I'm moving the ruler around very slightly, and this will create a curve around the top. So I can then join these dots together. I hope you can see that. This is within the seam allowance, so I'm not too concerned. And just round the corner there. So I've got a nice shape arc. If you do have an 11-inch template or a 14-inch template that you can just draw around as a circle, that would be absolutely fine. But I think this is probably the easiest way to get the right shape to the arc. And then I'm simply going to cut this round. Okay, now this is a little bit square for me, so I'm just going to trim across the curved bit here, again folded in half, cutting through both layers, and I'm just rounding this off a little more. So it's more of a dome shape now. Then I'll use this as a template to cut out the second outer piece, and then the same from both of the lining pieces. Then these will go to one side for now while we put together the zip panel. Again, the outer sections of the zip panel have the fleece on the wrong sides. Just take my lining pieces, and there's my zip. My zip is a little bit too long, but I'll cut that down to size in just a second. So I'm going to place this with the slider facing downwards over my fabric, and I'm just going to sew straight down the center of the zip tape. I'm not going to pin with this one. I find it easier not to. What I am going to do is to just move my needle over to the left, and then that will allow me to use my regular standard foot when I'm sewing on the zip, because the foot isn't actually going over the teeth of the zip, it's actually running alongside the zip, so it makes it quite easy without putting the zipper foot on. I do these individually. I know a lot of you would prefer to just do the lining at the same time and sandwich the two pieces either side of the zip. I prefer to do it this way because I can see more accurately where I'm going to sew. So the outer fabric on one side of the zip, and then I put the lining on the opposite side of the zip. If I did these both at the same time, I wouldn't be able to see exactly where the zip is. Whereas now when I sew from the same side, from the back, I can see my stitch line. So I just sew straight over the top of that stitch line. So it's a little bit more time consuming, but I know it's going to be accurate now. Then I'll repeat with the opposite side of the zip. So let's take the outer fabric, and this again will go right sides together over the slider side of the zip, and sew from the zip side so that you know you're sewing straight down the centre of the zip tape. I'm just lining up the edge of the fabric with the edge of my zip and sew straight down. It's got my zip caught in the foot there. And again, the lining goes on the opposite side of the zip. And I'm just going to press the fabric away from the zip, and then we'll trim it to the correct size. We'll do that on the lining as well. So again, just pull it away from the zip and press. And we will top stitch down each side of the zip to hold this in place as well. So I'll lengthen the stitch on my sewing machine. I'm going to put this on 2.8 because it's a top stitch, so it doesn't have to be a small stitch. Top stitches tend to look a little bit better in longer stitches, I think. I'm just stitching straight along the seam. Now maybe your fabric will want to kind of fight back a little bit because of the fleece, or if you're using a thicker interfacing like a fusible foam, it'll certainly want to bend back up again. So just keep pulling the fabric open, making sure that the seam here is sitting nice and flat. This is going to be quite a focal point of your bag, so it's nice to have it looking perfect. We'll turn around and go back down again the other side. And I think you'll see, when you see the fabric coming out, it does look so much nicer with a little bit of top stitching. It looks a little bit more shop bought, a little bit more professional with finishing touches like this. So try and keep your stitches nice and straight. It'll be very noticeable if they're wobbly. Stop with the needle down if you do need to stop. And there, we're almost at the end. Then I can trim off the end of the zip. Make sure when you trim off this end of the zip that the zip is open, so you're not cutting off the zip pull. And if you need to make these ends, like mine seems to have moved a little bit there, if you need to trim this down to make it straight, then of course you can do that. That won't affect the size or the look of the bag. Now we have the end pieces to go on the zip panel here. So 2 outer pieces and of course 2 lining pieces. And these are going to go on each end, but I also want to make a little loop just using some of the webbing. So let's cut a piece which is about 2 inches in length, and that's going to be folded in half and placed just on the end here, so it just creates a little loop. Again, it's those professional little finishes to a bag. So let's cut another piece. That'll be about 5 centimeters or 2 inches in length. And I'll do these all individually as well, because I think it'll make more sense as to what I'm doing. So fold in half, place over the end of the zip, and I'm just going to sew very close to the edge just to hold that in place, so within the seam allowance. And then take the second piece and again fold in half over the end of the zip. Try and keep the ends of the zip together. You could sew those together if you wanted to, and sew in place. Now this time I think we can do these all together. So place the outer section right sides together to the end, and the lining right sides together on the lining side. So let's line up these ends so they all meet. I'll put a couple of clips in here just to hold that in place while I sew. And I'm going to sew straight across here to join all those pieces together. Then I'll fold these 2 pieces back. You can press this if you wanted to, and I'm going to top stitch across here. So take it easy over the webbing, because it's the webbing and the zip, so that's quite a thickness of fabric you're sewing over. And that's one end finished. And then we'll do the same with the second half. By the way, when you're lining these up, these pieces should measure exactly the same as the zip panel piece here. If it doesn't work out exactly, so that could depend on how close you sew your fabric to the zip. If you've sewed it a little bit closer, it's going to make this section narrower. If you've sewn it a little bit further apart, it will make it wider. So if this is narrower, then trim this piece down to the same size, and you may need to trim the base down as well. If this is a little bit wider, then you trim the zip panel down. So all of this is the same width, and this also needs to be the same width as the base. So again, take it slowly over the zip section. There we go. And then we'll fold these 2 pieces back. Nice and flat, and top stitch. It's got a loose thread there, and that's part of the webbing was fraying a little bit. Let me snip that away. There we go. Now we're going to fold the whole section in half and make a little cut or mark in the center of the zip panel. Same on this side. So we'll put this to one side for now, while we put the pocket and the straps on the front and the back of the bag. Now I've only cut out one pocket for this bag. If you wanted to put two pockets, one on the front and one on the back, then that's absolutely fine. So I've got the two pieces of fabric together here, and I'm going to sew them together into a tube. So sew across the top and sew across the bottom. If this was a printed fabric, then it would be right sides together. Then we'll turn this the right side out and press it. You could, if you wanted to, add a trim. So I think on the first bag that I made like this, I put a little piece of lace across the top of the pocket, and that looked quite sweet, but it depends what type of look you want to your bag. So I'm leaving mine quite plain. I'm going to top stitch just across the top. No need to across the bottom. And then we'll arrange this on the front of the bag. Now I've folded my front and back of the bag actually in half and just made a little nick with a pair of scissors, so I've marked the centre point there. I could use that point, if I crease the centre of my pocket, to line up the two marks to make sure this is central. And let me just measure how far that is from the bottom actually. So say 2 inches from the bottom, or 5 centimetres would be a good position. And I'll just pop a pin in the centre there, so make sure the sides are straight and it's the same distance from each side. And then I'm just going to sew straight across the bottom. You don't have to sew down the sides. I'm just sewing straight across the bottom of the pocket to hold that in place. And then we'll put the handles on. Now I'm using webbing for the straps or the handles. You could make your own if you wanted to, but I've got this 1 inch wide webbing in black, so it matches my fabric perfectly. And these are cut to about 90 centimetres, which would be, let me just translate that for you, about 36 inches in length. But you make these to the length that you want to. So if you wanted longer straps to go over your shoulders, that's fine. If you wanted shorter straps so you just hold it, then that's fine as well. Now I've got a little bit of a tip for you. When I put these straps on, I'm going to actually glue them on before I sew them. So the straps are going to go over the raw edges of the pocket. Remember, that's not sewn down. And I'm going to sew these in place up to about here, so up to maybe 1 inch or 2.5 centimetres from the top of the pocket, because we need to put the zip panel in here and I don't want to interfere with the seam allowance. So I'm going to put a little drizzle of glue. You don't have to do this, you could just pin it right down the centre up to where I'm going to stop sewing, and then glue that in place. By the time I've come to do the second side, that glue will be dry. So make sure this isn't twisted. And 2 reasons for this. I find it holds it in place better than pinning would do, but also it strengthens the handles because you're going to sew and you're going to glue as well. So it's popped down there. Make sure this is straight and make sure that the raw edge of your fabric is covered. And then we'll take the second side of the bag. I'm going to do this upside down so that I can match up those same lines so I know that they're going to meet. And again, I'm going to drizzle a little glue along here and then match that up. Again, make sure it's straight. Turn it around and it's not twisted as well. A little bit of glue and match. Now if you wanted to take a ruler and measure and just make sure that those are in exactly the right position, that's fine. And then I'm going to sew on, oops, caught, up one side, across and back down on all 4 pieces. Don't need that pin in now. Now remember, both on the front and of the back of the bag, you're not going to sew the handles all the way up to the top. You're going to leave that the same distance from the top on both sides, like so. Right, now I've already got my centre marked on the front and back of the bag. What I've also done is to fold the zip panel in half and mark the centre of the zip panel as well. So we're going to line these up and sew them together. Make sure the handle is down and out of the way. Line it up here, and I'm just going to pop a few pins to hold this together. You can use clips if you prefer. So starting at the centre, I'm just going to work my way around the edge. Now just to warn you, when you're fitting this, your panel may be a little bit too long. And that's something that I've allowed for deliberately in the measurements, because I can't guarantee that your curve is going to be the same curve as my curve. Your curve may be a little bit shorter if it comes around here. It may be a little bit squarer. So because we're not actually using a pattern, again, the template that you use might not be exactly the same as mine. So that's not a problem at all. If you come to the end of pinning these together and you find that the panel is slightly too long, when you've sewn it in, trim it off. That's absolutely fine. That was all part of the idea when I was coming up with this bag, to just make it easier. So I'm pinning all the way around, and then we'll sew it. Do take your time to do this. Don't just start sewing, because you might find that it doesn't quite work. And use lots of pins as well. Really secure this in place. Okay, and then we'll sew all the way around. Now at this point, we're going to turn it the right side out and make sure that we've caught all of the fabric, and that curve is a nice shape with no pointy bits, because this is going to form the shape of your bag, so we want that to be a really nice neat seam around there. Now your lining needs to go on the opposite side, so right sides together with this part of the bag means that the zip section is in the middle of it, and that's fine. Still make sure the handle's out of the way. If you wanted to pin this down, then you could do. So make sure this is all out of the way. I'm going to again mark the centre top of my lining piece, just like I did with the outer fabric. I'll find my scissors. And then starting at that mark in the centre, just like we did before, I'm going to pin this together and then sew. Like a dust magnet, this black fabric, isn't it? So again, moving this out of the way, it will start to feel a little bit bulky, and that's fine. It'll be even more bulky when we put the second sides on. As long as the area that you're stitching is nice and flat, don't worry if that zip panel gets all crumpled on the inside, that's fine. And lots of pins just like before. Make sure that's nice and secure. And then back around the opposite side. And again, if you prefer to use clips, then you could use clips. I prefer pins, to be honest, because they're a little bit more secure when you've got fabric that's fighting back like this is with this big lump underneath it. And I like these long pins as well, the flower head or button head pins, because I can see them and they do tend to go through lots of layers of fabric quite easily. Okay, now I'm going to sew from the side that I've just sewn so I can actually see where I'm going. And we'll sew that lining in place. I'm not worried about trimming the seams back. I don't think it makes much difference, to be honest. I'm going to turn this through and check again that I've caught all of the fabric. Sometimes you can miss a bit. So there's the outside of my bag, and that's the lining side. And you don't see any raw edges around the lining there at all, so that's really nice and neat. Now we need to do the opposite side. So let's turn this back again. And just like we did before, I'm going to pin, make sure the straps are out of the way, pin where I marked the centre at the top, all the way around, and then we'll sew it just like we did before. And then just like before, I'm just going to turn this through and make sure I've caught all of that fabric. When you've got a lot of layers like this, sometimes it can kind of move a little bit as you're sewing, and you can miss a little bit, so I just want to check that that's nice and neat. Now remember when I said it's going to get a little bit bulkier? This is when it does, because now we need to put on the second side of the lining. So push it back out inside out, and the lining needs to go right sides together. I'm just going to mark the centre point of this one again. It needs to go right sides together with this one. So the right side is here, so all of this is in between where this section of the lining needs to be. So we need to fold this, make sure the straps are in the middle. We need to fold all of this out of the way. And then your lining goes on the top. So line up the middle section. Again, if it helps, this is very, very bulky. You could put a few pins in here to hold that down. I'm just going to put one in the middle there. That may help. And then again, starting at the centre, just like we did on the other pieces, we're going to pin all the way around the edge. It may feel a little bit tight, but it will do because you've got all of this in the middle of it. So push all of the rest of the bag out of the way and just concentrate on the raw edges meeting or matching around the edge. Be careful as well, actually, when you're going around the curved section, particularly of the lining, because it doesn't have any stabiliser or interfacing on it. The curved section will stretch. So just try not to stretch the fabric as you're pinning it, because of course the curve's cut on a 45-degree angle. So again, really lumpy here, but I'm just moving that away from the seam so that where I'm going to sew over the seam, that's going to sit nice and flat. One more pin should do it. And like before, I'm going to sew from this side so I can see where my stitch line is already. It makes it easier to follow. And we'll just sew all the way around. And let's turn it the right side out. Oh, I left my pin in, didn't I? No, now we'll turn it the right side out. So now you can really start to see what your bag's going to look like. So you only need to sew the base in now. Okay, now with the base, the lining and the base can be sewn in at the same time because we're not going to turn this through, we're going to bind it. So I'm going to use a little bit of 505 spray to hold these two pieces together. So I'm just putting a piece down the centre here. I'm not spraying the table, and of course keep that away from your sewing machine. Place this on top. Now if you're going to use a bag base, that can go in between these two pieces, but don't put it right up to the edge. You don't want to be sewing through that. So trim it back by about ½ an inch all the way around. Don't think it needs it on this one, but if you want to make it a little bit firmer, then you can put a bag base in. I was just turning this inside out again. Another way of doing that, which may be a little bit easier actually, is to sew the base in as it is, and then cut a piece of bag base to the same size as your bag without the seam allowance and cover it in fabric. And then you can drop that into the inside of the bag and maybe use a few hand stitches or some glue to hold it in place. Right. Right sides together again. I'm going to just overlap the end of the bag. Oh, I need to open the zip first actually. Or slightly, so I can turn it through again. Let me just undo this a little bit. So again, we're going to overlap by your seam allowance, so by ½ inch. So we're not going to start sewing, there's my seam. We're not going to start sewing with that lined up against the seam. We're going to overlap it by the seam allowance. And pin it. Same in this corner, and pin. And we'll do this all the way around. So when you come to pivoting, actually it might be easier to do this one piece at a time. If you're sewing up to this point, my pin there is right where the seam is on this side. You're going to stop here and then pivot. So don't sew right up to the end of that fabric. Stop at your seam allowance. So stop ½ inch away from the edge, or 6 millimeters, pivot, and then turn around and go this way. I'll see if I can show you accurately. So take out your pins as you go. So I'm coming up to the corner here. Before I get to the edge, so about here, I'm going to stop sewing, and in fact that's on top of the seam underneath. I can feel where that seam is. Lift the needle, the foot up with the needle down, and then we're going to turn this around and then sew down to the next piece in the same way. So So I'm going to pivot this around, line up the next side. If you prefer to pin, then you can do. I'm actually finding it easier not to. Into that seam, needle sitting on the top, pivot it around. No need to leave any turning gap with this one. We're going to sew all the way around, down the next side. Remember, all this is going to be covered up with bias binding as well, so don't worry about these raw edges looking a little bit untidy. Stop on top of the seam, pick it up, turn around, and yet ultimately this is in the bottom of your bag. So if this is the first time you've made a bag like this, it can be a little bit complicated until the penny drops when you've made one. But if this is a bag that you're going to use, it doesn't really matter if your stitches are a little bit wobbly, does it? It's nice to have perfection, but it doesn't always turn out like that. Okay, so base sewn in. I'm again going to check and double check that I've cut all of the fabric, because if I need to correct anything, it's easy to do that now than when I put the binding on and the whole bag's finished. So I'm making sure that I've caught again, like before, all of the layers of fabric all the way through. See, this is what happens. Just missed a little bit of the end of that there. At this point, I can now turn it back again. You can't tell from the inside. And let's turn it back through. And I know just where that handle is. I just need to make that seam allowance a little bit wider so I catch it. See, I could have edited that out. But these things happen, particularly when you're not following an exact pattern. There is a little bit of hit and miss. And I think it's quite nice to know as well, when mistakes do happen, how you can rectify them. So that was the strap that I hadn't caught. I've sewn a little bit closer now, so I've actually caught the edge of the strap in that seam. So now I know I can put the binding on. Now for the binding, and I'm using bias binding because it's what I had, it was shop bought. It doesn't have to be cut on the bias because we're not going around any curves. So I'm just going to open it up slightly and fold over the end. And then I'm not going to pin this, I find it easier not to. I'm going to sew this to the edge of the bag. What I would want to make sure of is, if you can see the seam here, I don't want to sew on this side of the seam because that's going to affect the shape and the size of my bag. So when I line the two pieces up together, I'm going to make sure that the crease line that I sew along is either on top of or just very slightly towards the raw edge of that seam. And I'm not worried about neatly mitering the corners, because you're not going to see them. So again, as I go, I'm just going to place that crease over the seam and sew only a stitch width to one side of it. And when I get to the corners, I'm just going to stop on top of that corner seam with the needle down, lift the foot up and turn it around. Maneuver the binding so that the edges meet my bag, and sew. And we'll do this all the way around. Now my binding is, I say shop bought, just happens to be exactly the same colour as my bag. I think you'll find it looks a lot neater if you can use exactly the same colour as your fabric. If it's plain, and if it's patterned, use the same fabric. You will need extra on the materials list if you're going to do that. I didn't allow for making your own binding. Remember, it doesn't have to be biased, so it's not going to take up too much fabric if you were to make your own. If you wanted to make a real feature of the binding, then use a contrast colour. But I think it's easier to keep it looking neat if you use exactly the same. It becomes invisible. You don't actually see the binding on the inside of the bag. So if you are giving this as a gift or you're selling it, self-coloured could be a lot more forgiving than a contrast colour. Again, I keep just turning this around as I go. When I come back to the beginning again, I will need to trim the binding down a little bit. It will be too long. And I'll need to make sure that the ends overlap slightly as well. So coming to the next corner, almost there. Manoeuvre this around. And I will be sewing the second part by hand, because to be honest, sewing it on the machine I find far too fiddly. Personally, I find it a lot quicker to sew by hand. Right, I'm just coming to an overlap here, so I'm going to overlap the binding by about 1/2 inch or about 1 centimetre, and sew. Right, and then we will flip this over the edge and use the same colour thread. And I like to take the needle into the seam allowance so the knot disappears, then pull this over and then sew. Now I'm using a slip stitch, so I'm going, oops, just got that caught. I'm going into the bag and bringing the needle out into the binding, and keep the stitches about 1/4 inch apart. And don't sew all the way through, because just like I was saying about the seam before, if this stitch goes all the way through to the front of the bag, then you're going to see it on the outside of the bag, and that's the last thing that we want. So I'm just keeping this, like catching the lining, maybe a little bit of the wadding, that's fine, and we'll sew all the way around. Then we'll turn the bag the right side out. I'm just about finished. So you end up with, I think it's quite a nice size bag, a very useful bag. And when you look on the inside, no raw edges. So it's really nice and neat from all angles. And the one final thing I would do is to press it. And obviously if it's wrinkled, press it all over. Maybe a tailor's hand would help when you're inside the bag, but I like to press on the seam so I can make that seam nice and crisp. So use lots of steam if you've got it, and just go around all the seams like this and give them a good old press, and I think you'll find that the bag sits a little squarer when you finish it like this. If you wanted to use a little bit of best press or spray starch, that would help as well. So you go all the way around yours more carefully. Let's just press across here, push that seam out. And again with the seam, whoops, right on the edge, give it a good old press. Now, I was mentioning earlier about putting a base in the bag. If you wanted to add that now, you will need some extra fabric again, because that wasn't allowed in the fabric requirements. But at this point, if you wanted to cut a piece of bag base to the width in between the seams of the base on both sides, cover it in fabric, and then you could either hand sew into the seams or glue the base in place. You could also add bag feet as well. I'd do that before you put the base in. And obviously follow your manufacturer's instructions depending on what kind of bag feet that you have. But that's my finished bag. I hope you like it. Hope you make lots of them. And I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.